Good morning, everybody. Today is Thursday, May 21st. It's Mr. Tinnel. We are covering the second half of the civil rights movement today. Starting out with good things. Jen and I watched the NASCAR race last night. Happy that live sports are back. It was a fun race. It was down in South Carolina. And this weekend, the big Coke 600 is up at the Speedway, so keep an eye out for that. But my good thing, I'll share the video of it. This bizarre thing happened. A fox ran out onto the track during one of the cautions. There was a rain delay. And he ended up running off, and he was safe. So yeah, that was my good thing. Hopefully, you guys have been staying entertained with the rainy days the past few days. But again, I think tomorrow and this weekend the weather's supposed to turn around. So jumping into today's lesson, once again we have some guided notes. 10 easy guided notes that you can follow along with that go along with this presentation. So on Tuesday, we looked at kind of the beginning of the movement and the struggles that were happening that were leading people to really start protesting and organizing, whether it was rights being taken away, segregations, obscene lynchings. These things light a fire under the African American and just American community. People start saying, we need to start fixing these things. It doesn't happen quickly, but it begins to happen. And one of the first things that we see and that we all know is the famous protest by Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat in the black section of the bus for a white passenger. She refused to get up out of the bus, out of her seat, and she was arrested. Now, this was an organized protest. This wasn't spontaneous, but the thought had been there that if somebody tried to push against this segregation ruling on a bus, there might be some success that could come out of it. And there's a boycott organized against the Montgomery bus system. So the bus system of Montgomery is boycotted by the entire African American community. They boycott the buses for a year. Now think about how crazy that is. Think about being so behind a cause that you inconvenience yourself for an entire year. That's how committed the Black community was to this in Montgomery. Think about walking to school every day for a year and not taking the bus, staying off the buses for an entire year, doing whatever you had to stop riding a school bus. That's a lot of commitment. And eventually, because of this protest, buses are desegregated in Montgomery. So we do see successes starting to come from these protests, and the Montgomery bus boycott being one of the first. And this movement is led by a young reverend named Dr. Martin Luther King. This is one of Dr. King's first organization efforts, and this propels him into a national spotlight. He is a minister, eloquent speaker. He was an advocate for peaceful resistance, nonviolent resistance. He's the leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. They organized a lot of protests and organization movements in the South. But obviously, we all know Dr. King. But his persistence of nonviolent protest is important because that's one end of the spectrum. We're going to see a full other end of the spectrum once we get further into this presentation. With nonviolent protests, we see a new movement start called sit-ins. So sit-ins were where you would go and sit in a space that you were not supposed to be in. So there were lunch counters. Think about how if you go to Walmart, there might be like a Subway up front. These are the types of lunch counters we're talking about. There was a Woolworths department store in Greensboro. It was a department store, and in that department store, it had a lunch counter, like the picture that you see here. African Americans were not allowed to eat at that lunch counter. They could shop at the store, but they couldn't eat at the lunch counter. So a sit-in was organized, where 4 Black students from North Carolina A&T organized to go and sit at the lunch counter. So it was a protest. They weren't going to buy anything because they couldn't. They offered. Every day they sat down. They offered to buy something, but they were not served. And so they sat there, and they continued to sit there. And this led to a whole new protest method. Well, what are they doing wrong? Nothing. They're just sitting. How can you get mad at somebody for sitting? How can you get mad at somebody for taking up a space? It was a perfect nonviolent protest. And this is one of the first major sit-ins throughout the country, and it spreads all over the country. There are a lot of supplemental links and videos here. I suggest following them. This one is very good. This one talks about the Greensboro 4 and Woolworths lunch counter, and that still exists. There's a museum up in Greensboro. The museum up in Greensboro still exists, still has a section of the lunch counter. It's a very cool place to check out if you haven't ever been up there. There also are sit-ins that start happening across the country. This sparks a sit-in movement. There was a very famous one down in Rock Hill that happened. And eventually, lunch counters begin to desegregate. So it's preparation. There were sit-in tactics. There was a whole manual of what you should do during sit-ins. And this is being prepared to deal with what could come at you during a sit-in. People blowing smoke in your face, people spitting on you, people leering and jeering at you, people pouring things on your head. Moving into more protest movements, the Freedom Riders were a group of students, of college students that organized to drive through the South to test if buses, interstate buses like Greyhound buses that would come between states, test if buses were desegregated. They just rode on buses throughout the South and made sure that everywhere they went, it was desegregated. Because the problem was, you start in Washington, D.C., Washington, D.C. was desegregated, but then you take that bus down into Alabama, and Alabama is segregated. So what happens to that bus en route? They were just bringing up the hypocrisy of that. If you were on a bus that was desegregated where it started, well, how could it end up in a place where it was where it was segregated? Back up, you understand. It was peaceful until Alabama. They face fire bombings, attacks on their buses. President Kennedy had to step in and bring the National Guard in to help protect the Freedom Riders. So you see the bombings of the buses. Similar to the Little Rock Nine, where we were working to desegregate public schools, there was also an effort to desegregate public universities. James Meredith is known as being the first African-American man to attend public school in the South, a public university in the South. He was accepted to the University of Mississippi, and the University of Mississippi lost its mind. The campus started rioting. James Meredith worked very hard to. He faced a lot of struggles at the school. The governor of Alabama at the time, George Wallace, becomes a national figure. He says a lot of terrible racist things during this time period. He's absolutely an advocate of segregation. There's a lot of back and forth between him and Kennedy. They butt heads. See George Wallace standing in front of the building gates. And then once again, there's still violence. Violence is still happening. We see that violence happening in Birmingham, Alabama. At the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, the Ku Klux Klan planted bombs underneath a church, the 16th Street Baptist Church. And 4 young African-American girls were killed at the church from this bombing. We used to live in a country where bombings were regular. Just it's mind-boggling to think. And this isn't just like, oh, well, this is just a Deep South thing. No, there were bombings in Charlotte. The lawyer for the Swan versus Charlotte case, his home was bombed. These are things that happened on a regular basis. It's just insane to think that this was our country. Because of protests that happened after the Birmingham bombing, Dr. King is arrested. Dr. King is arrested for leading a protest. And then he writes, while he's in jail, he writes his famous letter from Birmingham jail, very moving letter, that really starts saying, like, why is this happening? And what do we need to do to fix it? And not just why is this happening, this is why we are doing it. He lists reasons why the civil rights movement is working towards these goals. Tons of great pictures here. Very, very moving pictures. So I said Dr. King was at one end of the spectrum, the nonviolent spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is the Black Panthers and Malcolm X. So Black Panthers were a group founded by Huey P. Newton. Their goal was to protect Black communities by meeting violence with armed resistance. Black Panthers would openly carry guns and follow police officers. They worked hard at advocating for poor communities. They worked hard at trying to bring up African-American communities, but also just poor working class people. But it's just one of those, they're a controversial group. You want to support somebody who's working to help African Americans and working class, but when you're following police officers and you're kind of being a little aggressive in the streets with guns, obviously that becomes a little controversial. Same with Malcolm X. Malcolm X is a very controversial figure. He taught Black self-reliance. He believed that the only people that would help African Americans were African Americans. So again, Malcolm X is on that other end of the spectrum. Dr. King, not only did Dr. King believe in nonviolence, Dr. King believed that the Black and white communities had to work together in order to find peace, in order to create laws, in order to put good politicians into office. Blacks and whites had to work together. Malcolm X did not believe in working with white people. His argument was, we've tried to work with white people for years. It hasn't gotten us anywhere. We need to rely on ourselves. Malcolm X says a lot of controversial stuff. He basically, when President Kennedy was assassinated, Malcolm X was asked, how do you feel about President Kennedy being assassinated? And Malcolm X said, I believe that's just chickens coming home to roost. And chickens coming home to roost doesn't make me sad, it makes me glad. Basically, he's saying that he has no problem with President Kennedy being assassinated. Obviously, you cannot say that you are okay with President Kennedy being assassinated. It's things like this that really hurt Malcolm X in the public sphere. Eventually, he begins to tone down his rhetoric. He kind of starts to become a little more moderate. But at that time, the group that he had worked with, the Nation of Islam, he left them. They ended up assassinating him in New York. One of the most famous protests, one of the most famous marches in the Civil Rights Movement was the March on Washington. Dr. King gives his famous I Have a Dream speech that everyone has seen on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. See a video of the speech and an overview of the march there. Both are really, really important. I would check those out. And this march leads to actual action by the government. The government does something because of this protest. See, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is the goal. We see all of the voting rights that we've been fighting for. The voting rights that should have happened after the Civil War 100 years earlier are finally realized in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Prohibits segregation, gave the executive branch the power to enforce this. 1965, and I apologize, there are two major laws created: Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Both of those are what the civil rights movement have been working for. Laws that ended segregation, laws that ended voter disenfranchisement. These protests were working. You see that with the 24th Amendment. The 24th Amendment was also created from the March on Washington, and that bans poll taxes. Okay, so March on Washington, I kind of brought two major laws together in this, so I want to separate them so we understand what's what. Civil Rights Act of 1964 ends segregation. It makes segregation illegal. That's what the March on Washington had been working towards. Voting rights haven't happened yet, and there still needs to be some push to get voting rights to happen, voting rights laws on the books. And we start seeing that. Sorry, here's some pictures with the March on Washington. So we start seeing voting rights happen with Freedom Summer. Freedom Summer is the movement that pushes voting rights. You see the voter registration drives beginning in 1964. College students going throughout the South, registering voters. But while this registration is happening, we see massive amounts of violence. This leads Dr. King to go down south to Selma, Alabama, and lead a protest because there's been so much pushback to this voter registration. In Selma, we saw Bloody Sunday. Dr. King was organizing a march, and during this march, Dr. King and his protesters were attacked on the Pettus Bridge in Selma, and this was broadcast on television. It spread all across the country that these unarmed, nonviolent protesters were attacked by police. Eventually, they reorganize and they lead a march from Selma to Montgomery. And that is a very important video too. I would really check that out. But this leads to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, ending voter disenfranchisement, allowing all registered voters to vote, no matter white or black. So the volunteers killed during Freedom Summer. And then we see the end of the movement happen in 1968. Most people agree that Dr. King's assassination really brings a stop to the movement. Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, 1968. He was there helping workers organize. They were trying to organize a union, I believe. And he gave a very moving speech. And it's just, it's eerie to hear it, considering it was his last speech. Again, I really suggest checking that out. And to end this, I want to look at a few statistics. And I'm going to buzz through them. You can look through them a little bit more. But the question, has full equality been achieved? And these are statistics created by several different groups within the United States government. These are government organizations that put these statistics together. But we still see many disparities in America. Dr. King. We see many disparities in unemployment by education and race. We see disparities in racial wealth, white families versus African American families, on average. Suspensions, prison sentence, drug use and arrest by race, job callbacks by name. See current events that happen, links to these in the presentation. So with those last bits, I don't want you to look at that and say, man, what have we done? We haven't done anything. No, we have done things. The civil rights movement changed so much. It made so much progress in this country. When I hear Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, I see that in our classroom. The fact that I have classes full of black and white students, Dr. King would be thrilled to see our school. Are things better? Yes. Can things get better? Absolutely. There are still fundamental problems in this country, things that we still need to work on. But you can't say that we have had no progress. We have absolutely had progress. Things are good right now, but again, they can get better. There's still racism in this country. There's undoubtedly still racism in this country. There are still things that we need to work on. But we also need to see how we have progressed. The things that we saw in this, we should look at and say, wow, how did that ever happen? Those things should seem crazy. But that doesn't mean that we have to accept some of the things that are happening now. We always always have room to progress. Everyone should be living happy, healthy, fruitful lives, not just a few. So that is the wrap up for today. A lot of stuff covered in these past 2 lessons. If you have any questions, feel free to see me. Feel free to hit me up with any questions. Hit up those guided notes, and we'll have one more lesson for tomorrow. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. We'll see you later. Bye.